Jesus gave his life a ransom yonder on Calvary, on Mount Calvary, cruel Calvary. Paved the way by blood that we might win a bright shining crown. Praise his holy name. Salvation has been brought down, oh glory. Praise the Lord, blessed Lord.
We welcome you to the Harvester Podcast. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 8. I am Brian Kenyon, and along with me are
Stephen Ford,
Forrest Anamasaris,
George Beals.
And George is a guest speaker on the program this time. He's been on there last couple episodes, and we're thankful that he's here again today. And we are continuing our discussion on homosexuality. On Episode 6, we looked at what does the Bible teach about homosexuality. And then Episode 7, last time, we talked about addressing some of the arguments against what the Bible teaches about homosexuality. And today we want to look at some cultural things, what's happening in our culture relative to homosexuality. And we're going to begin by referring back to a court case that was in 2015, a decade ago, but yet has done a whole lot to shape the attitudes and the ways people think about this topic. And it's known among some as the Obergefell. There he is. Obergefell decision. And so, George, fill us in on what we need to know about that as we begin.
Well, thank you, Brian. I do want to talk about that and go into some detail to sort of set the stage for the discussion. But before I do, if I may, I would like to just characterize, if we step back and try to characterize what's been happening in our culture more and more over the decades with respect to homosexuality and related matters. The way that I would summarize it all is that subjectivism has gone to seed. That is, whatever I feel is right, whatever I want to be right, is what makes a behavior right. It's the idea of I feel I want to be a blank, and fill in the blank. A man says that he wants to be a woman. A woman says she wants to be a man. A boy to a girl to a boy. Maybe even a human to a favorite animal. These are called furries. There are some that actually believe that. I heard a documentary one time where a person said, "I am a cat," and so if I feel that I want to be such and such, that's what makes me such and such, irrespective of my biological makeup. So subjectivism gone to seed, and I'll just say a word or two about what I mean and what is meant by subjectivism versus objectivism, and then we'll lead into this Obergefell decision by the United States Supreme Court, and then take it from there. So if this were a video, I would show you a line drawing that I have used over the years to distinguish between objective ethics and subjective ethics. But here, in this audio, I'll have to draw a word picture of it. So if you draw in your mind, draw a circle, and inside that circle, call that I feel. And then an arrow pointing down to this action is moral, and then another action pointing down to this action is immoral. So that's subjectivism. I feel that something is the case, or maybe I choose a selected number of other human beings who feel a particular way about a particular action. That is what makes it. Whatever they feel, that's what makes it right or wrong morally. That's called subjectivism, moral subjectivism, as opposed to objective ethics. And objective ethics can be illustrated like this. Again, draw a circle, and in that circle, put human beings, and then draw a line from that circle up to another circle, and in that put God, and then an arrow down from the God circle saying this is moral, and an arrow down from the God saying this one is immoral. This is illustrating the fact that objective ethics is that the human being looks outside of himself to determine what is right and wrong, not within himself as the basis of morality. So what we see here in our culture are manifestations of subjective ethics, more and more, frankly, worse and worse. And this is in contradistinction from biblical ethics, because biblical ethics teaches that subjective ethics is wrong. For example, Jeremiah 10:23, the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man to direct his steps. That's a rejection, then, a denial of subjective ethics, and an affirmation, then, of its alternative, namely objective ethics. The objective standard, the standard of right and wrong outside of us, is God and His Word. That's where we learn about God's will. And it's God, then, that determines what is moral and what is immoral as to our actions. Now, with that having been said, let me talk about this Obergefell v. Hodges decision of the United States Supreme Court in 2015. I think that's an important decision and action that has been made in our culture. And what that did, this was a razor-thin decision, a 5-4 decision that requires all states in the United States and its territories to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples and recognize such marriages. As you might expect, liberal Justices Ginsburg, Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan, unfortunately along with the swing vote at that time, Kennedy, made up the majority. And the four who opposed it were Chief Justice Roberts, along with Justices Scalia, Thomas, and Alito. Now, let me just, before I say much more, talk about the subject of legal theory. I won't get into this in too much detail, but just to point out that there is a legal theory out there that has been influenced by people who hold to it, who have been influential, are people like Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. and then legal scholar Jerome Frank. And this will give you a flavor as to what I'm talking about. For example, Frank, quoting another with approval, affirms that judge-made law is real law. That is, judges start with their own conclusions. He says this, quote, the process of judging seldom begins with a premise from which a conclusion is subsequently worked out. Judging begins rather the other way around. A man ordinarily starts with such a conclusion and afterwards tries to find premises which will substantiate it, unquote. Again, quoting another with approval, Frank explains that, quote, now note this, the judge really decides by feeling and not by judgment, by hunching and not by ratiocination, ratiocination being looking at premises first and then drawing a conclusion, reasoning to those conclusions. He says such ratiocination appearing only in the opinion, unquote. So how do these judges, how do these hunches come to a judge? He says it like this, quote, the rules and principles are one class of such stimuli, but there are many others concealed or unrevealed, not frequently considered in discussions of the character or nature of law. They have been usually referred to as the political, economic, and moral prejudices of the judge, unquote. And then quoting Holmes, he says this, the real justification of a rule of law, if there be one, is that it helps bring about a social end which we desire, unquote. So that's what you're seeing here. Obviously, these 5 liberal justices have made a decision out of their own viewpoint. Now, there is in other words, there's a social position that they adhere to, an ideological viewpoint that they hold to, and then I believe that they've gone into the Constitution and American law and tried to search for a justification for it. The other judges say that justices say no, that they think that they have found something in American law when in fact it's not there. And if you examine this decision carefully, and you can find it, it's online, you'll see that the 5 liberal justices have taken a position that imply that the New Testament is wrong, because they talk about the integrity and the fact that we should be doing this and we should be affirming this and so forth and so on, and that we've grown to the point in this culture where we've come to these decisions and we sort of have learned these, etc. And but yet, when you look at the Bible, it's clear that what the Bible has to say is in conflict with their decision, and so then they have infringed upon, I believe, the religious rights of citizens, and that forcing it down our throats, a decision that we believe is contrary to the Scriptures. They are not morally neutral, in other words, in their decision. Now, from there, and prior to that decision as well, the culture has seen a lot of activity in the direction of homosexuality and transgenderism and so forth. And we can just enumerate some of these to get this out on the table, and then we can look at some discussion about these matters and what the Bible has to say. Maybe I can point out some of the books that are aimed at children. Let me give you some titles. Adopting My Two Dads, another. Albert the Confused Manatee, another. Bob the Ladybug, Bob's New Pants, another. A Cat Like That, and then Daddy, Papa, and Me, another. Daddy's Roommate, another. A Girl Named Adam, and a whole bunch more. So the gay affirming community has had some success in incorporating books such as these and other vehicles into the public school system, and to the objection of a lot of us. And understand that it is mandatory in this country for a child to go to school. And I believe what has happened is that when the social left has got in power, that is to say, when they get governmental positions, they've had a tendency to use the power of the state to force down the throats of the society their ideological viewpoints that, in these cases, are contrary to the Scriptures. Now, a question arises, how should we deal with these matters? Well, there are other actions and other matters as well, and maybe some of the other folks here can talk about other manifestations of this thinking that is in the culture. You might want to talk about gender changes and so forth. Anybody?
Yeah, when you were speaking about that, and the one quote really stood out where the justices or the judges are ruling social things that they've already decided upon that they want to force and see in society, which of course is totally backwards from the way judges should be operating. And it made me think of Herod in Mark chapter 6 and verse 8. Where John the Baptist said unto Herod, it's not lawful for you to have thy brother's wife. And so here's a law where civil law, it's okay to do that. And even our country, we mentioned this, I think, an episode or two ago about, once we start allowing divorce and remarriage for any reason, contrary to God's word, then as a country, as a legal system, we open up the door for any kind of marriage. Any kind of thing. And so, once we move away from that standard, there's nothing holding us back. And so we have to stick to the standard. And of course, judges are not to judge based upon what they wish was the case, but they're to judge based upon the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and all of that, at least in this country.
Yeah, and I think that's a good example. I think one of the things we need more of, maybe we could say, is we need some more John the Baptist type characters, right, who will say what needs to be said, regardless of the consequences, not just to be belligerent or contrary, but because truth matters and out of a love for God, you know. And I think for whatever reason, sometimes, and I think part of why this, you know, Obergefell case is so consequential, because a lot of times in our culture, once something's legal, to speak against it kind of becomes like almost like a type of like public heresy or public blasphemy, right? Where it's like, well, you might have your opinion, but the Supreme Court has spoken, right? So that idea of, even if it was civilly lawful for Herod to have his wife, John understood there was a law that transcends that law, right? That we're all beholden to. And that, I think that's what we need to be pointing people to more and more as, you know, our civil law in points where it disagrees, have the courage to say, hey, even like that was a personal basis. But you imagine you're imprisoned by a man and you got an opportunity to speak to him, and instead of trying to butter him up and try to get out, you're just telling, hey, you're sinning, right? You're not supposed to, you know. So I think that kind of courage we need more of, and not allow these things, you know, kind of have this defeatist mindset of we can't speak on these things because the Supreme Court's already spoken. God has spoken, and that's what's most important, and we need to share that with others.
The other side of that, too, is that when something is legal for, let's say, the left, they will appeal to the law as the final word. However, if something is illegal that they want to do, they will appeal to popular opinion. And so it's kind of speaking out of both sides of their mouth. It's not an ideal. It's not a situation where they're saying, hey, we just want to be legal. It's an idea. We want to do what we want to do, regardless of if the law says what it says. And it really demonstrates, or at least it calls to mind in Acts chapter 17, where there's a group of people who are not necessarily trying to do what the Lord wants them to do. And when things are being taught that should set the world right, they say these have turned the world upside down. And so to many people who are promoting sinful behavior like that of homosexuality, it may feel as though their world is being turned upside down because they are living, they aren't living right side up in the world. And so it may feel as though things are unfair, unjust, harsh toward them. In a previous episode, we talked about the terminology of homophobia and things of that nature. So it may feel as though they may be verbally or socially or legally accosted, but that's because the things they're doing are immoral. And what we're promoting is not being mean to them or anything, but let's just promote what thus says the Lord, because that is what is good, right, and everlasting.
I think there's a tendency on the part of the left to be originalists regarding the Constitution when the Constitution is in agreement with them. But then, if the Constitution is in conflict with what their view is, then we need to expand upon and update the Constitution. So, and of course, you can also make that application. There are some people that do that with the Bible. They'll hold to the Bible if it's in harmony with their wishes.
Judge not.
Matthew 7:1, right? And on the other hand, if it's not in harmony with my view, then the Bible needs to be improved upon, or maybe use strategic silence and ignore certain passages. That is not an honest way of studying the Bible.
Or twist the hermeneutics
Right.
to get it to teach what we want it to.
I'm also reminded of Acts chapter 5. If I could just read, looking at verse 25. No one came and told them, saying, "Look, the men whom you put in prison and are standing in the temple and teaching the people." Then the captain went with the officers and brought them without violence, for they feared the people, lest they should be stoned. And when they had brought them, and they set them before the council, and the high priest asked them, saying, "Did we not strictly command you not to teach in this name? And look, you have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine, and intend to bring this man's blood on us." But Peter and the apostles answered and said, "We ought to obey God rather than men." So there we have a biblical case of opposition to free speech. Fortunately, in this country, we have free speech in the Bill of Rights, and we need to exercise it, especially on matters like this. And furthermore, if a politician is whether on the left, Republican or Democrat. Usually, it's on the side of the Democrats, frankly, that take a position that is anti-biblical, in conflict with the Scriptures. Frankly, that person now is fair game and needs to be rebuked as well.
That's a great point. I think, a lot of this, too, comes back to authority, where obviously as citizens of this country, we recognize the authority, for example, the Supreme Court has, the executive branch has, et cetera, et cetera. But we also have to acknowledge there's an authority above that authority to which we're all beholden. And, the Supreme Court doesn't get to define marriage. Mm-hmm. The United States of America didn't invent marriage, right? God did. Right. So if we're going to talk about, who's the eligible party for a marriage, when is a marriage, what marriages should be quote unquote recognized, we have to go to God to find that out. And anything we say that contradicts Him, by definition, is false, and by definition, doesn't have to be heeded to that degree.
Yes, and it's a good point. We talked about that back in episode 5, a lot of stuff there about marriage. But I thought also that the homosexual thing is almost like in a different category than other legal decisions. Like, for example, we can speak against drinking alcohol, even though we're allowed to by law.
I think that goes back to the whole immutable characteristic and the identity
absolutely.
And everything like that.
And that's what I was going to point to, because it's almost like speaking against the sin of homosexuality, you're speaking against, in their mind, someone's personhood.
Right.
That's their identity as a person, and so to deny them that, you're denying them their personhood, their civil rights, et cetera, et cetera. But such, of course, is not the case, because God's law, as has already been said, is above all that. Mm-hmm. And so we have to stick with God's law.
There is a passage over in Acts 18 that gives good advice to a member of the government. This is coming at looking at verse 12. It talks about Gallio, who was a Roman consul, proconsul of Achaia, a Roman official. And it says, when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat, saying, "This fellow persuades men to worship God contrary to the law." And then verse 14 reads, "And when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, 'If it were a matter of wrongdoing or wicked crimes, O Jews, there would be reason why I should hear you. But if it is a question of words and names and your own law, look to it yourselves, for I do not want to be a judge on such matters.'" Now, we could extend that, of course, to moral issues as well. But the government, according to the Scriptures, is if they make a ruling that is, and try to implement it, that is contrary to the teachings of the Bible, then, of course, in Acts 5:29, we must obey God rather than men. There may be consequences to that, but nonetheless, that's what we're supposed to. That's what the Bible would have us do. God's word.
I think too. Sometimes we talk about quote unquote culture wars. I know that used to kind of be a buzzword, but I think that there needs to be a sort of call to action for Christians to, for lack of a better phrase, produce culture, right? Like all these gay books are trying to get into schools. We need to be writing Christian children books, in my opinion. This is just my opinion. Other people might disagree with me. But why aren't we writing, and I know some of us are, shout out PGK Publications,
Right.
But we should be writing Christian children's books. And whatever that process is to try to get it in the library, try to get it in the library. Like worst case scenario, they're going to say no, and there's going to be a stink, and it'll bring attention to it at least. You know what I mean? Things like that were kind of, hey, because we want to influence as many people as possible with the truth and for good, and it seems like for whatever reason, it seems like oftentimes the people on the ungodly things side of things are a lot better about, I don't want to say pushing the issues, but getting those things in front of people's faces. You know what I mean? And I think that we have an opportunity at least to be strategic and to try to say, hey, we're going to, as Christians, we're going to make some of our own stuff, and we want people to hear this, and especially with marriage. I think part of the reason why this is, obviously it has to deal with the interpersonal relationship, but also we know that marriage isn't just a Christian issue. Marriage is foundational to all of society. And that's not a Christian idea. I mean, people have been talking about this for hundreds of years, thousands of years, right? Where households and families dictate the rest of a civilization. So I think we're just talking about, from our perspective, a degree of this is what kind of society do we want our children to grow up, grandchildren to grow up in. We know all things are possible with God. We know even if society gets flushed completely down the toilet, by faith in God, we can overcome and we can still be victorious. But in the meantime, I don't see anything wrong with Christians, us trying to produce our own culture, for lack of a better term. I mean, here we are having a podcast, right? We want people to listen to this, to hear it, to think about these things, hopefully to be convicted about these things. And that's the kind of thing, from my perspective, we need more of. Why
do you suppose there is a reluctance on the part of Christians to do that?
I don't know.
It does appear to me that sometimes this subject matter, for example, is not brought up in Bible classes or sermons. Are some brethren and professed Christians afraid of the repercussions from the state or the social pressure that they're going to experience?
I think some of it might be, I know, from the perspective of those who may be in the congregational setting who aren't members of the church. Sometimes there's this, this uncertainty of, I don't want to burn a bridge before I have the opportunity to cross it. I don't want you to write me off because of a political opinion before I have the opportunity to share the gospel with you. But obviously when these political issues, quote unquote, are moral issues and the gospel does speak to them, obviously I would argue we have the mandate to speak on these things: abortion, homosexuality, the gender stuff, et cetera, et cetera.
I don't see that a politician gets to hide behind politics if he takes such a position.
Right.
He becomes fair game in that case. Now, if we're talking about legislation having to do with the speed limit out on Main Street, or what the budget is supposed to be, you want to have $350 million on this, on infrastructure versus $325 million, go for it. Right. But when they get into matters that the Bible insists upon as being obligatory, whether prohibitions or requirements, and they start legislating and limiting what the Bible has to say, now they've become fair game. That issue has become fair game, even though it also is political in the society. And we must speak up. Acts 5:29, we must obey God rather than man.
Yeah, and I think there's a reluctance sometimes, even on Christians' part, that they just don't, they're kind of like non-confrontational. Their idea is, well, I'm just going to live the gospel myself and teach my family. What you guys do. But, of course, that's just kind of going to allow this to grow and stuff. And I remember something you told us, George, a long time ago, when your daughter was in school, that you would sometimes go to the PTA meetings or the school board meetings or whatever.
Back before that was on nightly news.
Yeah, and stand up for what's right. And that really encouraged me to do things like that. Of course, my kids were out of school by then, but as parents, we can be involved in those things. City commission meetings, county commission meetings, things like that. If we take the time.
Run for president.
George Beals for president. How about that?
President Stephen.
Mm-hmm.
Ford. We need a new
Ford in the White
House.
Ford.
There you go.
But anyway, there are things like that we can do that may seem minor, that may seem inconsequential, but they do make an impact. And then especially when multiplied by many church members, they do make an impact. And so those are some things that we can and we should do. Just basically whatever opportunity we have to speak up for truth, might be in the line at the grocery store or whatever opportunity we have to stand up for what the Bible teaches, we should take advantage of that.
I think that the one of the things that could be an issue, I don't know that most people, or many people anyway, would be afraid of litigation more than I think there's a social pressure. That people don't want to be ostracized because of their opinions, and so we keep them to ourselves. The other side may be, I think that some people may have a defeatist sort of attitude, because it's so loudly shouted, it feels like all the world is, leaning toward homosexuality or whatever perverse sexual thing there is of the day. And that's not the case. I think that most people are moderate thinking people. I think that most people would want to uphold some sort of moral standard that would be at least closer to scriptural authority than not. But the idea that's promoted is that that's not the case, that everybody's doing it. And so, if you feel I'm one voice in a sea of millions screaming the other thing, then you may feel, well, my one voice won't matter. When in reality, there are lots of voices, and we just need to make them heard so that we don't end up in a situation like after Joshua, where there's a generation of people that don't know God. Mm-hmm. We want to continue to promote. We want to continue to preach. We want to continue to herald the news. And not just within our homes, though that is good. There are neighbors, friends, coworkers, family members, strangers that need to hear the same good news to know that there is a better way to live. There are better promises to lay hold to. There are better ways to interact with people. There are holy ways to interact with people because there is a judgment day coming. That's one of the other things that I think needs to also be promoted, that there is going to be an end to this world. And in various places throughout the New Testament, you'll find warnings about life. With the end, there's a judgment coming. And so if people are, not to scare people hellfire and brimstone every day, but the reality of it is we are heading toward an end. And just like a doctor would tell you, sir, ma'am, if you don't stop, your health condition is going to result in your death. Not that they are wishing for your death. They want you to be able to make a sober decision and realize just how grave your situation may be. And so in the same way, we need people to understand just how serious their situations are and that there is a solution, that right. Jesus is the solution. Whether you feel I'm compelled to do this action because I was born this way, whether you feel that I was, objectified or I was subjected to certain things and so now I feel this way. Whatever it is, the Lord Jesus, through his word, can help us to know that there are better ways to live and give us guidance in how to live those ways.
What about the medical profession? The fact that there is now an industry among medical doctors in doing sex change. Any thoughts on that? First of all, how much of that is happening?
Yeah, my thoughts on that is it goes back to Romans, well, it ties back into, for me, Romans 1, 26 and 27, going against nature. You cannot get any more going against nature than injecting with steroids to, female hormones into a male body. Genital mutilation basically is what it is, but I mean that's just, you can't get any more against nature than that kind of stuff, and that's explicit, literally going against nature, and it's just terrible. It should be a crime that. You should not be allowed to do that to anybody against their will. And what child? I mean, what child would actually really want that? And we're talking 4, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old children that has been done to in some states. And so I think it's just an atrocity.
And some of it's irreversible, as I understand.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, and I think, thankfully, it seems like the tide's starting to change on that a little bit. I don't know if you saw, I think just the other day, the Department of Health and Human Services released a 300-page paper, which was surveying how they've been dealing with, some of the sex change operations and the puberty blockers. It was just a comprehensive review, and this was just last week, and it really is a departure from what it's been for a while, where there's nothing wrong with these puberty blockers. We have to affirm their gender, which of course, if our physical characteristics doesn't impact our gender, why do I have to change my physical characteristics to affirm my gender, right? The whole thing kind of is nonsensical and inconsistent. But I think it is one of those follow the money situations where follow the money. I mean, there are people who are profiting off of this, and from everything that's coming out, it doesn't seem like they're going to be for a whole lot longer.
I'm reminded of 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, for which some have strayed from the faith in their greediness and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. Again, the love of money is the root of all evil. Now, not that money is, but the love of money.
Right.
And people are making a profession out of this and getting paid for it. And there I came upon what was called an atlas the other day. I think that was published in 2023, that is aimed at medical doctors, written by 2 medical doctors, and aimed at surgeons, showing them how to perform this, what we would call genital mutilation. And it's just part of the whole situation of that we're running into. Now, Isaiah chapter 5, verse 20 says, "Woe to those who call good evil and evil good, who put darkness for light and light for darkness." And then over in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, we're told to be able to give a reason for the hope that is in us. And Forrest mentioned this getting involved ourselves in the culture and having an influence. As a matter of fact, the whole field of apologetics can be divided into 2 sections, 2 giant sections. One is called cultural apologetics, which is just that. That is, it focuses on what is happening in the culture, the influences, the various means and media by which people are being influenced, books, podcasts, TV programs, and a lot of other things. And that need not be limited to those who are opposing the Scriptures. And then the other field is intellectual apologetics, which deals with arguments for the existence of God and the Bible as the Word of God. But cultural apologetics certainly has its place.
And we will definitely follow up on that in another podcast sometime, the whole apologetics thing. But we're kind of running out of time here. We just appreciate the input from these brethren. And I just think about what was said earlier. I think about what Paul preached to Felix. He reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. And I think if we take those 3 areas serious and we get the word out in our communities, in our schools, and whatever influence, we can also make a change for good culturally by using the Scriptures. And I like what Forrest said about making our own culture and having that influence the present culture. And that will go a long way toward combating some of the foolishness being perpetuated by our culture. Well, we appreciate your listening in on us, and if you have any questions or follow-up, we would invite you to go to our website and leave us an email. We would love to communicate with you. But until next time, we thank you for joining us, and hope to see you next time as we continue our discussions on these cultural issues in Season 2 of the Harvester Podcast.
Jesus gave his life a ransom yonder on Calvary, on Mount Calvary, cruel Calvary, paved the way by blood that we might win a bright shining crown. Praise his holy name. Salvation has been brought down, oh glory, praise the Lord.